Welcome to another episode of the Ronyo and DaRon podcast show. I'm DaRon. Today we're talking source code review with Logan Coulson from OverDrive. And you may remember we've actually spoken with him in a few of our previous episodes where we were discussing how he moved from an application development profession into software security, application security, just I guess cyber security, whatever you want to call it these days. Stupid industry keeps changing its names. I guess that's what you do when you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? You just change its
Yep,
name.
exactly. Look, it's marketing, right? And you want
100%.
better pay? Well, how about you get a fancier title instead?
Yeah, that unfortunately accurate, and that's actually yeah, that's a different that's its own thing, and that's I don't think a lot of people realize how much of this is driven through the DoD contracting world. When we write proposals, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but when we write proposals, a lot of times we're trying to sell the government on something that, for the most part, exists already, but it's our special way of doing it, or maybe we added some things, or we have this experience, that experience, and so you'll get organizations naming things and changing names on things to try to make it sound fresh or new. And then that eventually makes its way, weirdly enough, into the DoD contracts. And then from there, it oftentimes makes its way into the civilian world. There's typically, it feels like it's probably a 3 to 4 year lag between when you start seeing it in proposals, government proposals, and when you see it enter into civilian vernacular.
Which makes sense. I mean, a lot of the government contracting companies are pretty exclusively government,
Yeah,
so it takes time for employees to leave, to shift to the civilian market,
right.
to propose these awesome new ideas that got their previous company a whole bunch of money,
That's exactly right.
and
Which is the
so
same
on.
idea as what they were doing before.
Yep, exactly.
Really quickly, we're going to be working today with the damn vulnerable bank application. I didn't name it. This is actually a system that we mentioned once before. Ronyo and I discussed really briefly. I was expressing my disdain for the way that it's written and how, in my opinion, poorly it's written. And I want to actually, since you're here and you also have done development for a number of years, I want to ask how many, I guess, how often have you seen security professionals write code, and what have been your general thoughts when you saw it?
So that depends on how you define code. So if you're talking full up applications, not often. I have seen writing out a skeleton of an application, essentially doing the design phase, which again wasn't intended to be implemented, just an example. I have also seen writing essentially small scripts to accomplish some task, but rarely have I seen security being the one who actually writes the application. They might write individual components. They might work with the design phase and help to make sure that the design produced is securable, but they're generally not going to be doing the actual application writing.
And I think that's really important to note because I have seen places where they tried to get security teams to write code. And I'm not talking about for a report as sample code for a report kind of deal, but every time I've ever seen that happen, I've always tried to pump the brakes on that idea because security professionals, by and large, aren't developers. And even if, let's say, you were talking about myself or yourself, just to give two examples, actually, I'm a terrible example because I still actively write code professionally. But let's go with you. I'm going to pretend like I don't write code professionally anymore, like I haven't for years. But if we were talking about just the fictitious me and then yourself, I'm going to assume you probably aren't actively writing code professionally.
Yep.
The languages change, right? Even when you talk about languages that are extensively used, they have changed over the years and vastly. The C++ that I was writing back in the 1990s is very different than the C++ of today. The even a relatively, I don't want to say dead, but not frequently used language like Pascal has changed since I used it in my younger development years. I, I just, I don't think people realize that even if we are talking about professional developers like yourself, it's been a while since you've written code. Things have changed, right?
Yep. Yep. They have. I mean, when I was writing code, again, it was mostly full stack web
Mm-hmm.
application development. Again, a lot of the tools for interacting back and forth with SQL servers have changed. And when I was writing it, it was all generally you create procs to do everything. Now it's very much so you essentially do it on the server side, you create the proc and send it directly that way. Again, we were running in .NET, I think 3.5. They're now up to like .NET 7 or 8 and .NET Core, which is pretty significantly different. Again, the basics are the same, but the details are quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you get into say JavaScript, right? When I was writing, React wasn't a thing.
Right.
Well, now it very much so is, and that's also very different. Again, as a security professional, I can follow, trace, and understand what's happening in a React application. I could say edit it, fill in small components. Could I write one from scratch? Not in a time efficient fashion.
Right. Right. That's, I think, spot on, and people need to keep in mind, and I mentioned this before, there is a gulf between reading code and being able to write code. You can read code, understand it, say, hey, there's a vulnerability here, and understand immensely what that vulnerability is. That doesn't mean you would be efficient at writing it, or that you would even be able to, because writing requires more. It requires the ability to structure, it requires the ability to think through how to actually compose whatever this thing is. And that's not something that you need to know or have when you read.
Yep. Yeah, they are similar but very
Yeah,
different. Which admittedly can also be quite entertaining because, how I write code is often not how other people write
that's
code.
true.
So, say, structure organizations, things like that can be very different, which can make finding out where the actual code that does the work is interesting.
Yes, that's actually really, I like that point a lot, because you wouldn't actively actually be part of the development team. Your thought processes, your design, your architecture aren't wed to how they do it. And that's a problem. You would think, oh, well, that's great. This frees you up so you can create your own library. But they operate in a very specific manner. And as I'm certain you know, when I create a standalone library and I just throw it out there, if it could do a function that people want, but if it can't do it in a way that they want it, in a way that's palatable and usable, it's all pointless.
Yep, absolutely. And if this isn't something that you held a need to design and use, your solution probably isn't going to be palatable.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. That's very true. All right, so let's dive into this really quickly. Let's take just a high level overview. We can see we have 1,209 warnings, 521 weak warnings, grammatical errors, typos. Again, I mentioned before, but a lot of times we slowly but surely we ratchet things down as a system becomes more mature, as a development team becomes more mature, as their processes, procedures, etc., become more mature. We start actually increasing the number of checks that we're doing, and then we can also modify the checks. We know, for example, that this development team's coding style says constants are on the left. Well, typically, I expect them to be on the right because that's how most development teams do it. And if I haven't adjusted this, well, now I can adjust it because I'm more comfortable with how your development team does it. And that may seem like a weird thing. I don't know. I don't know if you hear someone mention something about constants being on one side or the other, if that makes you wonder why the hell would DaRon care about that? But it actually becomes a big thing over time. And I'm just curious, does it make sense to you why that would be something I would key in on?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have how coding styles and coding standards form is well, you've got the team. It's usually not going to be a hey, so we're starting up a new software company. Let's write out our coding standards, and then we'll roll them out. We'll hire developers and then train them on it, and they can start writing code. It's usually going to be let's work out the basics of this idea in the basement, type it up. Okay, now let's get some funding. Then we can hire some developers to fill it out and go from there. But that usually means that your coding styles are going to be governed by whatever you did initially, or ideally by the team lead, or what have you. So it's going to be very personal. It's probably going to be what they usually do. At least, ideally. Of course, other times, say you have that team lead who doesn't work on instructing their employees in how to do stuff, you can get all sorts of nuttiness. But that's also another thing to look for, right? And if you can narrow in and start identifying where they're following this code style, you're then identifying, hey, so this is the relatively modern stuff that they've at least touched recently. The stuff that isn't
Yes.
matching that coding style, well, this is older stuff, legacy stuff, or maybe it's written by a new employee who's not
Yes.
fully familiar with the coding style. This
Yes.
is, in theory, more likely to be of interest because it's not
Yes.
written as professionally.
Yes, that's exactly right. That is spot on. I've actually I ask because I've had developers who, and I've had non-developers, mostly non-developers, or junior developers who would sit there and they go, "Well, but why do you care what our coding standards are? Why do you care that we enforce them?" And exactly what you're saying, because that's again one of the key things is we're looking for things that don't pass the smell test because this is quick. I want to be able to zoom all around. As you know, every developer has their own style. We all do. Like you said, the way you decompose a problem, break out the structure, all this other stuff is going to be different than everyone else on the team. And that may be true, but if I have coding standards and coding styles, and I ensure that those are followed throughout, then I create a uniform process that allows me to see code that violates it. And that code could be poorly written code. That code could be, as you say, legacy code. That code could be maliciously inserted code. When you talk about things like people compromising your source code repository, that does happen. And if I have very strict and stringent coding styles and coding guidelines, it becomes a little easier to see when someone has inserted something. When a developer, a malicious developer, has inserted something that they shouldn't have. Because my coding standards say, thou shalt not call to system.exec. And by golly, there it is. Something like that. Coding standards are actually important, and they also, like you're saying, indicate the professionalism through which this code was written. And it can be however you choose to define your coding standards. That's not the issue. I want my constants on the left. I want my constants on the right. We do null checks this way. We do null checks that way. We use a gated architecture, which we've discussed before. We don't use a gated architecture. We'll have all of our public statics, our public constants in a constants file, and that is where it's going to be sitting in what's called a utility class. That's what it was, utility class. Now it's easy for me to say, oh, you have this constant, but it's not in the utility class. Since it's not in the utility class, I now know that this constant either wasn't on purpose or doesn't belong. And there's possibly a big issue here. And anyone who's using this may be inappropriately calling to it. So now I know what to be looking for as I do this code review because I'm going to examine that kind of thing. But so you will see a lot of code styling things in what we're looking at. And like I said, as you on board with a project, as they mature, you adjust your scans to match their coding style, to match their way of thinking, and then you just slowly but surely tighten the scans down. I guess I don't even probably need to delve into this one very much. We have links with unencrypted protocols. This is in a Postman collection. I don't know why this is actually in here other than for testing purposes. I I imagine you, like me, would take issue with what we're seeing inside of this collection. I'm hoping this doesn't mean that they have credentials hard coded in and that admin is not admin.
Yeah, I can see it potentially that, or maybe this is meant to run against a development environment that simply isn't exposed, doesn't contain any sensitive data. In which case, not a problem. If this is meant to be running against production to verify things are functional, that is potentially a problem. Again, it might not be. Let's say that we have this public, well-known one. Well, okay, we can log in. That it can't do anything, but you can log in and verify that this thing works. That's not a problem. But yeah, I would be a bit concerned about this.
Well, and actually, interestingly, to the point you made about, hey, this may be development, you're exactly right. But there's one important thing whenever we're doing something like this, and I know you're already going there in your mind. What you can never do is assume that people properly sanitize data as it moves through the pipeline, going from development to staging to production. And when it moves in the reverse, where I take that production data, pump it into staging and development for testing and development work, you see that constantly. You
Yep.
There have been instances historically where something that was supposed to stay in development made its way out of development and bad things happen.
Yep. And I have seen several organizations that they get their test data by taking it from production, running through some sanitizers and putting it in lower environments. Well, those sanitizers are usually going to be tuned based on like, with usually SQL here, but they're going to be tuned based on what the columns are.
Yeah.
Well, if you've added a new column or renamed a
Yes.
table or something, it's not going to get filtered.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
I suppose the flip side is like PII in the wild, right? I mean, any individual piece probably doesn't matter that much, but the more you collect, the more pieces you can pull together, you can suddenly start de-identifying it. That's why, honestly, I sort of think that anonymized data is a bit of a myth because
Yes.
yes, in that data set, it may well be impossible to identify. Well, if you add one more piece that's freely available, you can now fully identify at least some of those users.
Yes. And uh, I actually want to take this in two separate ways with two separate examples. And the first, of course, being we had a video where we looked at a system administrator who went rogue and did bad things, and he was using web anonymizers. He was using the VPN proxies and things of that nature, and going to hotels, motels, using their public Wi-Fi and all of this stuff to do his malicious activity. And it was distributed amongst all of these different locations. Some of it the bank, some of it another bank, some of it the web server he was pulling data from, specifically Microsoft Office. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we were able to link everything together because, as we discussed in that video, we had three packets that had his phone's IP address. Three. And from those three, we were able to tie that to the other activity, the other users through the activity profile, the IP address, and an assortment of other data. And that sewed together a beautiful, absolutely beautiful picture that got him put in jail where he belongs. The point being, you may think that you're anonymous, but you aren't. That you may think some data has been strained and has nothing sensitive, but it does. And we see that within the military with regard to troop movements, things of that nature. But the other place in our field, we see it all the time. And you and I have discussed this is when we look at input and output. And this is where that information disclosure comes in. And I see the system is bleeding little bits of data here, little bits of data there. If you are serializing empty and null variables, for example, that guarantees that I can see all of the data within the structure. So I know exactly what public variables I can set. I know exactly what public variables exist in your class. It takes the mystery out of it, and I map out your architecture. I map out exactly how your application looks, and it was just by collecting all of this data together. And there are a lot of people that's literally all they do as a job all day every day is collect massive amounts of data and then either find patterns or find the linkages.
And another example of that, like, so I work at OverDrive. It's primarily a service that sells,
Yes.
essentially sells stuff to libraries, and then users can then borrow those ebooks and watch it. Well, if you look at things, you'll note that the various ebooks tend to have a specific ID. And again, this is essentially the key for that ebook. It's used to retrieve title images, text, things of that nature. It's not sensitive per se, but at the same time, if, say, you're looking at one book and you swap that ID out for another ID, well, you're now looking at a different book. Again, this isn't a problem. We know this is a thing, so permissions and like are all appropriately checked. But that's also a pretty classic IDOR, right? I
Right.
mean, you're keying off of this ID. If you aren't doing things in that secure fashion, well, now that leak is interesting. Or, yeah, like, gather data from multiple points, or even just a single point, you can form a pattern, and suddenly data that was useless and meaningless is no longer useless and meaningless.
Yes. That's why the government heavily collects metadata. That's why companies heavily collect metadata. From metadata, I can know all things. I don't I don't need the actual data. I get as much as I need. If I can see who you call, when you call them, the frequency with which you call, and I don't need to know the contents. I really don't. I can discover that over the time. If I can see what books you check out from the library, I can build up a profile and say, oh, this person is, malicious. They have some kind of hidden intent. And that's what a lot of organizations do. Or if you're an advertiser, oh, she's going to have a baby. How do I know that? Because suddenly she's looking up baby toys and diapers and cribs, and it's the metadata that matters.
Yep. That story about that woman at Target who started getting, maternity
Mhm.
stuff, maternity ads and the like. She didn't know she was pregnant, but
Yes.
Target did.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, long story short, actually, if we do see something like Postman collection in data that we're given, this is a gift, a gift that you should definitely not look in the mouth. This is great data. I would look all over this and try to see if there's something I can pull from this that's meaningful and useful. And I definitely would be taking note of things like HTTP, but I would also use this to understand what the endpoints are. Because while this may not be well maintained, it probably contains endpoints that they didn't expect to bleed out, endpoints that I wouldn't know otherwise. So, test data is always great data. There's no ifs and or buts about that. Again, like we demonstrated last time, beautifully, IntelliJ IDEA will tell me that I have these libraries that are vulnerable, and actually in this case it's telling me the CVEs. It also tells me what the latest version of the software happens to be that I should be upgrading to. So it's just nice. Nothing I would spit at.
Yep. It's, of course, always the fun question with those is whether or not they're actually affected by whatever the vulnerability is.
Yes.
But that's also that other piece of it's probably going to be easier to update than to figure that out.
Yes,
Not always.
yes, you're right. So we do have the code, and we could go through and try to hunt down the imports. That would mean I would have to go through and I would have to look at the actual libraries in question and piece apart what is in this so that I can derive what the imports are. And then I'd have to look to see what the vulnerability is. Yeah, that's a lot of work. And yeah, it typically isn't worth it. Although some are pretty obvious. Like I believe it said log4j, but I didn't take a real quick look. So if it were log4j, the JUnit stuff, if it's compiled without the unit tests, and none of the production code is calling to JUnit. Obviously, that doesn't matter. It's not great. I still want you to update it, but the world won't die over it, kind of deal. This does have security warnings. We can see in here, we see that it says it's allowing user certificates, and we see that as the trust anchors. Obviously, that's problematic. We don't want to allow the inclusion of user provided certificates because those aren't necessarily secure. Anyone can add those, including malware, and users can obviously always be tricked. We do see, of course, clear text traffic permitted is set to true. It's not great, but this would wind up depending on the application. I do see people. I don't know. I'll ask you. I've seen a lot of people get snippy when we have internal network traffic that's unencrypted, but we're sitting up in, say, AWS or Google Cloud. And I know that there's a debate to be had both ways. In fact, I can have that debate with myself. But I think sometimes we forget that some battles aren't worth the fight, and at some point you've been compromised so badly it's a moot point.
Yeah, yeah. So if we're talking about communications between nodes in AWS, clear text traffic should only be a problem if somebody is in position inside those nodes to listen to your traffic. Now, encrypting that can well help with that. But you're in that situation of they're already in those systems.
Right.
They can probably decrypt the traffic anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
The jig is up.
yep. Now that said, of course, there's the mistake category, right? I mean, you're intending this to be internal only. It allows this, when you're operating within your cloud. But turns out the config you used, it allows, say, users to connect to you via HTTP.
Yes.
And, that's not necessarily a problem. You've got your stuff set up to just automatically redirect them to HTTPS. But what if you don't? Because you figure that every user connects via HTTP already. It's just a way to set yourself up to make a mistake.
Yes.
And the cost difference between HTTP and HTTPS isn't all that significant today.
Yes. You're exactly right. And if we're talking a mobile application, which we are here, then obviously this should be done. And it's very easy to take a system that wasn't a mobile application and turn it, reuse code, and accidentally forget that, hey, we're allowing this, but that's not safe in that environment. Whatever that may be, I actually see that kind of thing with some regularity. I also see where people accidentally expose things that they don't intend to. And to your point, actually, I just recently finished an engagement where they were accidentally proxying a whole bunch of different points, 9 different ports out into the public. They didn't mean to from their Bastion host. They did not mean to do that, but they were, and that included a lot of sensitive data. But it also meant that client systems could connect to the Bastion host over unencrypted channels, and that they did not mean. So outside of their VPN, if I didn't VPN in, I'd still connect, and no one would know I'm not VPN'd in. I wouldn't know, but now it's over clear text channels, which is exactly to your point. All right, so let's take another nice random one. Obviously, if set JavaScript enabled is set to true, we're here inside of currency rates. With something like this, look, now I'm going to look for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. But that's not the only thing. I'm going to look at client-side in general vulnerabilities. Web views typically do not include this capability. And I've seen a number of instances where rather than just use a web view that had this built in, they actually took another library, an actual JavaScript parser of their own. They slammed it into their mobile application and had the mobile application run it. It's the absolute worst thing you could do because then it doesn't sit within the context of that web view, and it's much easier to escalate privileges break out because there is no sandbox at that point. At least in this point, there's a sandbox of sorts. But look, I can tell you from this, it's going to be really easy to do cross-site scripting. And actually, that's just by glancing at this code, glancing at the settings that they have.
Yeah. I mean, like, essentially, any time where you are effectively saying, "Hey, yeah, this code's totally good and safe. We should run it." You sort of need to make sure it actually is.
Yeah.
Like, and I've seen applications that operated by essentially storing the website. You know, the idea was they've got a structure. You have different organizations that might be using this structure. So, they, instead of creating a separate website for everyone, they basically create a database entry with whatever customized information is necessary for these other sites. Well, those database entries may well include scripts and other things that need to execute. So now you're in that position where, hey, so we're loading this stuff from the database, but we don't really know what it looks like, but we're just going to run it arbitrarily. And again, if the database is secure, that's not a problem. If it's not secure, though, or somebody has access to it elsewhere, or even somebody makes a mistake, now you have a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. You are exactly right. I'm going to actually skip a few of these because I mean, they're great stuff, but I don't want to focus on it too much. Well, that's it for today. I hope you all enjoyed, and please like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let us know. Thank you, Logan. This was at least fun for me. Hopefully, it was fun for you.
Yeah, it was fun for me as well. Thank you for inviting me.
Have fun.